the living art. The night was heavy with the weight of 1,000 untold stories, the air thick with the scent of rain-soaked pavement and the distant hum of New York City's unyielding chaos. In the heart of the city's art district, hidden away in a narrow alley, was Mary's tattoo studio, a small, dimly lit space that held the whispers of countless souls etched in ink. The walls were adorned with her artwork, each piece a testament to her passion and ambition, but the flickering neon sign outside hinted at the struggle beneath her resolve. Business had been slow, and in a city where dreams were as common as the rats in the subway, Mary was desperate to make her mark. It was late when the bell above the door chimed softly, signaling the arrival of a new client. Mary looked up from her sketchbook, her eyes meeting those of a man who seemed out of place among the usual crowd. Elliot, he introduced himself, his voice low, almost a whisper. There was something unsettling about him, a quiet intensity that made the hairs on the back of Mary's neck stand on end. He was pale, with deep-set eyes that seemed to hold secrets too dark to share. Elliot requested a tattoo unlike anything Mary had ever seen before. A massive, intricate design meant to cover his entire back. The pattern was complex, almost mesmerizing, with lines and symbols that seemed to shift ever so slightly as she stared at it. Despite the unease crawling up her spine, Mary agreed to take on the challenge, not knowing that this decision would mark the beginning of her descent into a living nightmare. Mary's needle hummed steadily as it danced across Elliot's back, the ink seeping into his skin with each precise stroke. But from the moment she began, something felt off. The ink, normally so predictable, seemed to take on a life of its own, shifting and swirling just beneath the surface of Elliot's skin, as if it were being drawn deeper into his flesh. Mary paused, her hand trembling slightly, and looked closer. The lines appeared to pulse, almost as if they were alive. "Is everything all right?" Elliot's voice broke through her concentration, calm and detached. His lack of concern only added to the unease gnawing at her. "Yeah, just thought I saw something," Mary muttered, forcing herself to continue. She wanted to stop, to ask questions, but there was an urgency in Elliot's tone when he had first arrived. Like this tattoo was something that needed to be done. "The design is exactly as it should be," Elliot murmured, more to himself than to her, his voice laced with an eerie certainty. Hours passed, the work more grueling than usual. Sweat beaded on Mary's forehead, and her hands grew unsteady. A wave of dizziness hit her, making her vision blur, but she dismissed it as the fatigue of a long day. By the time she finished, she could barely stand. As she wiped away the excess ink, Mary noticed something bizarre. Elliot's skin seemed to absorb the ink completely, leaving no trace of the fresh tattoo sheen. It was as if the ink had become one with his body, merging into his flesh in a way she'd never seen before. Mary blinked, trying to shake off the disorientation. It had to be a trick of the light. But as Elliot rose from the chair, stretching his newly adorned back, she couldn't help but feel that something had shifted, not just in the room, but within her as well. In the days following Elliot's tattoo session, Mary's life began to unravel. It started with a faint, almost imperceptible itching on her arms. When she finally examined the skin, her breath caught in her throat. There, etched into her flesh, were the same strange symbols she had inked onto Elliot. At first, they were faint, almost like scars, but as the days passed, they grew darker, more defined, pulsing with a life of their own. Sleep offered no escape. Each night, Mary was plagued by vivid nightmares, visions of her body covered in the dark, shifting symbols. In her dreams, the markings twisted and writhed beneath her skin, as if something malevolent was trying to claw its way out. She would wake up drenched in sweat, the sensation of the symbols moving under her flesh lingering long after the dream had ended. The symbols began to spread, snaking across her body in dark, sinister lines. With each passing hour, the pain intensified, sharp, burning, like her skin was being seared from the inside out. The hallucinations followed soon after. Shadows seemed to creep in the corners of her vision, and whispers echoed in the silence. Panic gripped her, and she withdrew from the world, locking herself away in her apartment. Desperate, Mary tried to contact Elliot, her only link to the nightmare she was living. But he had vanished. No phone number, no address, nothing. It was as if he had never existed. The realization sent a fresh wave of terror through her. She was alone, with no one to turn to as her body and mind were consumed by the living art. Driven to the brink of madness, Mary finally managed to track down Elliot. Her search led her to a desolate part of the city, a forgotten building shrouded in shadows. She found him in a dimly lit room, surrounded by strange, eerie art, each piece more disturbing than the last. Desperation fueled her as she confronted him, her voice trembling with rage and fear. "What have you done to me?" she demanded, tearing at her clothes to reveal the dark, pulsating tattoos now covering nearly every inch of her body. Elliot turned to face her, his expression calm, almost amused. "You were chosen, Mary," he said, his voice eerily soothing. "These tattoos, they're not just ink. They're a conduit, a way to harvest the essence of those who wear them. You see, I'm a collector of souls of life, and you, my dear, are becoming my finest piece of living art." Mary's breath hitched as the truth sank in, but before she could respond, the tattoos began to writhe violently, the pain searing through her. She fell to her knees as the markings spread faster, consuming her flesh, warping her body into something unrecognizable. Her skin twisted and bubbled, transforming into a grotesque, pulsating canvas. Mary's vision blurred as the tattoos consumed her, twisting her flesh into a grotesque canvas. Her humanity slipped away, swallowed by the dark, pulsating ink that writhed beneath her skin. The world around her faded, narrowing to a single point of focus, Elliot's satisfied smile. Her body, now a twisted masterpiece, stood motionless, a living work of art, eternally bound to him, her soul forever trapped within the ink. The Mask. Los Angeles buzzed with life, the streets teeming with people and possibilities. In the heart of an artsy neighborhood, where murals adorned every wall and the scent of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the sea breeze, Barbie thrived. Her world was one of color and creativity, a skilled makeup artist known for her ability to transform faces into works of art. She spent her days in her cozy studio, surrounded by palettes and brushes, always searching for new inspiration to fuel her passion. One afternoon, while wandering through the neighborhood's eclectic mix of shops, Barbie's attention was drawn to a small, cluttered thrift store she hadn't noticed before. Curiosity piqued. She stepped inside, the bell above the door chiming softly as she entered. The air was thick with the scent of aged wood and forgotten memories. She browsed the dusty shelves, her fingers brushing over old books and trinkets, until something caught her eye, a mask, half hidden in the shadows. It was unlike anything she had ever seen. The mask was ancient, with intricate carvings that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. Its features were both beautiful and unsettling, evoking a strange mix of fascination and unease. Barbie felt an inexplicable draw to it, a pull she couldn't resist. She knew immediately that she had to have it. Without a second thought, She purchased the mask, her mind already racing with ideas for her next special effects project. As she left the shop, the mask tucked securely under her arm, Barbie had no way of knowing the dark power it held, or how it would soon become the canvas for a horror far beyond her imagination. Late one night, as the city's hum quieted to a low murmur, Barbie sat in her studio, surrounded by half-finished sketches and tubes of paint. The ancient mask she had found at the thrift shop rested on the table beside her, its eerie allure impossible to ignore. She had been working on a new special effects design, but something wasn't clicking. Frustrated and eager for inspiration, she glanced at the mask, an idea forming in her mind. Perhaps if she wore it, she could better visualize the transformation she sought to create. Carefully, Barbie lifted the mask and placed it against her face. The instant it touched her skin, a sharp, searing pain shot through her. It felt as if the mask was biting into her flesh, its edges digging in like claws. Gasping, she tried to pull it off, but the mask wouldn't budge. Panic set in as she tugged harder, but it was no use. She stumbled to a mirror, her breath hitching as she watched in horror. The mask was fusing with her skin, its ornate edges melting into her flesh as if becoming part of her. Over the next few days, the changes began. The mask didn't just sit on her face. It grew, tendrils snaking from its edges and burrowing deep into her flesh. The once beautiful carvings warped her features, twisting them into something grotesque and unrecognizable. Her once clear skin began to take on the texture of the mask, the ornate designs embedding themselves into her very being. Desperate to maintain some semblance of normalcy, Barbie avoided Nala, her best friend, terrified of what she might say if she saw the changes. She stayed hidden, covering the mask with scarves and makeup, but the transformation was relentless, and the mask's dark influence tightened its grip on her with every passing hour. The mask's curse spread like a poison through Barbie's body, warping her beyond recognition. It was no longer just her face that bore the mask's influence. Her entire form was changing. Her limbs began to elongate, the bones stretching painfully as her fingers twisted into grotesque shapes. Her once vibrant skin turned a sickly, mottled shade, the tendrils from the mask burrowing deeper, connecting with her very core. Every movement became an agonizing reminder of her transformation, but worse was the loss of control. Her body no longer obeyed her mind's commands. Barbie's thoughts remained sharp, a prisoner in her own flesh as she watched herself move with a monstrous, jerky motion, her actions no longer her own. She would reach out to knock over objects, her hands shaking as she tried to stop herself, but the mask's influence was too strong. She was becoming something else, something terrifying. Nala, growing increasingly concerned by Barbie's sudden disappearance from her life, decided to visit unannounced. The door to Barbie's apartment was slightly ajar, and a sense of dread washed over Nala as she stepped inside. The place was dark, cluttered, and the air was thick with an unnatural chill. She called out, but there was no response. In the corner of the room, hunched over and shrouded in shadows, was a figure that barely resembled the friend she once knew. Nala gasped in horror as Barbie turned to face her, revealing a face twisted beyond recognition, the mask's tendrils pulsing with a dark energy. Barbie tried to speak, to warn Nala, but all that came out were guttural sounds, her vocal cords twisted like the rest of her. Trapped inside her own monstrous body, Barbie could only watch as Nala backed away in terror, her eyes wide with disbelief. The mask's grip on Barbie tightened until there was nothing left of her former self. Her limbs elongated further, twisting into grotesque angles that defied nature. Her face, once familiar and warm, was now a nightmare of jagged edges and bulging tendrils. The mask had consumed her completely, fusing with her body in a horrifying union that left her unrecognizable. Her skin had turned a mottled gray, and her eyes, once bright with creativity, were now hollow, sunken pits, barely able to reflect light. Barbie's mind remained intact, fully aware of every grotesque change, every movement she couldn't control. She tried to scream, to cry out for help, but her voice was no longer hers. It was a twisted echo, a guttural sound that barely escaped her throat. The horror of her situation gnawed at her sanity, driving her to the brink of madness. She was trapped in a body that no longer belonged to her, a prisoner of the mask's dark magic. Nala, overwhelmed by the horrific sight of her best friend, transformed into a monstrous creature, backed away in terror. Tears streamed down her face as she turned and fled, the sound of her footsteps echoing down the hallway. She couldn't bear to stay, to witness the complete annihilation of the person she once loved. Barbie was left alone, her twisted form reflected in the cracked mirror across the room. The image staring back at her was a grotesque mockery of the woman she had once been, a monstrous figure trapped forever within the mask's cruel embrace. Unable to escape, she could only stare at the reflection, her mind screaming silently as the mask's dark power held her captive for eternity. The infestation. Elkhorn, Wisconsin, was the kind of town where everyone knew each other. A small, tight-knit community surrounded by vast, eerie rural landscapes. The town carried with it an unsettling air, known not only for its quiet charm but also for the dark legend of the Beast of Bray Road, a creature said to roam the outskirts, adding a layer of unease to the otherwise serene environment. Life in Elkhorn was predictable, the same faces, the same routines, and Jake, a 24-year-old mechanic, fit right into this pattern. His days were spent working in his modest garage, fixing up old cars and chatting with the locals. Despite the isolation, Jake found comfort in the simplicity of his life. One of Jake's few close connections was with Molly, his 18-year-old neighbor. Molly had practically grown up in Jake's garage, often stopping by after school to watch him work and share stories. Their bond was almost sibling-like, with Jake looking out for her as if she were his own sister. One morning, as Jake turned on the tap to wash his hands, he noticed the water running cloudy, with an odd, slimy texture that clung to his skin. He frowned but dismissed it as a minor plumbing issue, figuring it was just another annoyance to deal with. Later that day, Molly mentioned in passing that her family's water had been acting strange too, but they both shrugged it off, chalking it up to the old pipes in their houses. However, when small, pale worms began appearing in the water, wriggling at the bottom of his sink, Jake felt a flicker of unease. He dismissed them as harmless, perhaps just some debris washed in from the pipes, but a nagging feeling told him something wasn't right. Still, in a town as quiet as Elkhorn, it was easy to ignore small anomalies, especially when the day-to-day routine was so unchanging. Molly's health began to deteriorate in the days that followed. What started as a mild itch turned into angry, red lesions that spread across her skin, the irritation unbearable. When she showed them to Jake, they both assumed it was an allergic reaction, maybe from something in the water. Jake reassured her, suggesting she see a doctor, but neither of them imagined the true horror that was unfolding. A few days later, Molly burst into Jake's shop, her face pale with terror. She lifted her sleeve to reveal her arm, and Jake's heart skipped a beat. Beneath her skin, something was moving, small, thread-like worms, wriggling just below the surface. They twisted and squirmed, causing the lesions to pulsate with each motion. Molly's eyes were wide with panic as she stammered, "I can feel them, Jake. They're inside me." Realizing this was far more than a simple allergic reaction, Jake's concern turned to dread. Determined to find answers, he began investigating the town's water supply, tracing the contamination back to its source. What he found was worse than he could have imagined. Parasitic worms infesting the water, multiplying at an alarming rate. These creatures weren't just surviving in the human body. They were thriving, burrowing deeper and growing larger with each passing day. Jake tried to warn the town, but his pleas were met with skepticism. The townspeople, comforted by the normalcy of their routines, dismissed his warnings as paranoia or hysteria. But Jake knew the truth. What was happening to Molly could soon happen to them all. As the worms continued to spread, so did Jake's fear that the town of Elkhorn was on the brink of a nightmarish infestation, one that no one seemed willing to believe was real. Molly's condition deteriorated rapidly as the parasitic worms took hold of her body. The lesions on her skin deepened, becoming dark, festering wounds where the worms burrowed deeper, growing more aggressive with each passing hour. Her once familiar face twisted into a grotesque mask of pain and horror, her skin crawling with the writhing parasites just beneath the surface. Every movement she made was accompanied by the sickening sight of the worms squirming inside her, distorting her body in unnatural ways. As the parasites burrowed deeper into her flesh, they began to affect more than just her physical appearance. Molly's behavior grew increasingly erratic, her once gentle demeanor replaced by sudden outbursts of aggression and a disturbing detachment from reality. She spoke in disjointed sentences, her eyes glazed over with a madness Jake couldn't reach. He watched helplessly as his friend slipped further away, her humanity consumed by the creatures inside her. Desperation gnawed at Jake as the infestation spread through the town. It wasn't just Molly. More people began showing signs of infection, their bodies and minds overtaken by the same parasitic horror. The worms thrived inside their hosts, transforming them into monstrous versions of themselves, driven by an insatiable hunger that Jake couldn't comprehend. The once peaceful town of Elkhorn was quickly descending into chaos. Jake's own paranoia grew with each passing day. He couldn't shake the fear that he, too, might be infected, that the subtle itch beneath his skin was more than just nerves. The line between reality and terror blurred as he struggled to decide whether to flee the town or stay and try to save what little was left of Molly and the others. But deep down, Jake knew the truth. Elkhorn was already lost to the parasitic takeover, and the nightmare was far from over. Molly's transformation reached its gruesome conclusion as the parasites fully consumed her. Her body, once vibrant and full of life, was now a twisted shell, overtaken by the writhing worms that used her as a grotesque breeding ground. Her skin, stretched taut and discolored, barely contained the teeming mass beneath. Jake watched in horror as the last remnants of Molly's humanity faded, her body no longer her own. The worms, now grown and desperate to spread, began to burst through her skin in a sickening cascade, crawling out of her and into the surrounding environment, seeking new hosts. Jake was paralyzed by the sheer horror of what he witnessed, his mind struggling to process the nightmarish reality before him. He had tried everything to save her, but it was too late. Molly was gone, her body reduced to a vessel for the parasite's endless hunger. As the infestation continued to spread through the town, Jake felt a chill run down his spine. A subtle, but unmistakable wriggling sensation began beneath his own skin. He froze, terror washing over him as he realized with growing dread that he too had been infected. The worms had already taken hold, burrowing into his flesh, their presence undeniable. The full weight of his situation hit him like a tidal wave. Elkhorn was lost, its people overtaken by the parasitic horror that now controlled them. The once quiet town, known for its eerie legends, had become the site of an unimaginable nightmare. As Jake stood there, feeling the parasites moving inside him, he understood the terrifying truth. There was no escape. The infestation had claimed him, just as it would claim every last inhabitant of Elkhorn.